Well, I want to share a little bit from the book of Proverbs and just look, Proverbs kind of comes up as you're reading along, almost a little bit, the word random comes to mind, where sometimes you'll have a theme that, one verse will talk about a subject, and then another chapter, you'll have another verse about that subject. So I want to kind of put a few of those together on what Proverbs has to say about the concept of anger. And there's no way we can really cover every verse in detail today, so I'm not going to try to cover every single proverb on the subject, but we can get into a few of those and learn some of the wisdom God has to impart for us. Anger is something that we know from the New Testament is definitely a negative thing. Jesus warned in Matthew 5 about being angry with one's brother without a cause. And over in Ephesians chapter 4, there's a couple things Paul says about anger, showing it's not to characterize a Christian. He says in Ephesians 4:26, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." And then he goes on in verse 31, "Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice." So in the New Testament, we see that's definitely a negative characteristic. By the way, what do you think Paul's really talking about here in Ephesians 4? Don't let the sun go down on your wrath.
Don't sit there and stew on it. Solve the problem quickly. Solve the problem quickly.
Don't stew on it.
Because if you don't, it gets worse.
It gets worse. And really, if you think about it, verse 31 goes into that, where he says, let all bitterness, wrath, and anger. Well, what happens if we let anger grow? Really, bitterness, you could say, is the adult growth of nourished anger. You let that anger keep going, stewing on it, like you were saying, and it's going to turn into bitterness. So we can't maybe help experiencing the emotion of anger. When you get mad, it's not something necessarily that you always like it, you just are. But we can really choose to make the conscious choice to say, well, even though I feel angry, I know I can't let this go on. I know I have to give this to God. And sometimes there is a legitimate place for anger against evil. Even Jesus, it's been pointed out, Mark 3:5 was really angry at the hardness of the religious leaders. But Jesus said on the cross, "Father, forgive them." Jesus' anger never developed into a deep, malevolent hatred or into bitterness or anything like that.
Like you said there in that, it said with all bitterness, once again, if like Brandon said, if you just keep getting it, then you're going to get bitter, and then you're going to go start evil speaking of them, and then at the end of it is malice, and that's something that we don't want any malice in any of our hearts. That's bad, is what the old preacher said.
Yeah,
malice
well,
is bad.
I love how you pointed out that progression there, because really, anger is kind of the root of that. And it makes sense, that there's those collection of things, as like you say, it's going to end up in malice, and malice defiles us. Thank you very much. So obviously, since malice is such a bad thing, we don't want any part of that. As he said, put that out of our hearts. Take that away. Cleanse that. Wipe that clean. We don't want that in our lives. So, on the subject of anger, what does the book of Proverbs have to say? And there's a few really good passages, and a lot of it gets down to, in Proverbs, pointing out a specific, the relationship of anger and foolishness, and how foolish that is. And especially, how anger is started, how anger is dealt with, a few things along those lines. So we're going to look at some verses here, starting out in Proverbs 12:16. It says, A fool's wrath is known at once, but a prudent man covers shame. So a fool's wrath is known at once. What do you think that's talking about?
There's something to be angry at.
Okay.
And they're quick to bounce on it as
soon as that quickness, that speed. Well, think about what James had to say in James chapter 1. And I've heard James described as the Proverbs of the New Testament. I think it makes sense. But here in James 1:19, he says, "So then, my brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." Well, here we see the fool is the opposite of slow to wrath. He's quick to wrath, quick to anger. You know, the minute he's mad, like you said, he's just going to make that open display of anger.
The modern term of, you often regret your words, but never your silence is that exact thing.
Yeah, well, that's where it's going, because it makes sense. Why is that a foolish thing here? Well, because obviously, you start spouting off, you let that anger fly, and what could it be? Well, you might be wrong. You might have misjudged the situation. Another expression is, putting your foot in your mouth, right? It's one of those types of scenarios where you're quick to be angry, and anger causes such harm. It's like letting a bomb off. There's going to be consequences to that explosion. And so as we're going to see here, the wise man understands that and controls anger. The fool is, you're going to know the minute he's angry. And we're going to see in a minute a few Proverbs talking about he's kind of looking for opportunities for that anger. But a prudent man covers shame. And there's a few different translations that kind of give different ideas. The ESV says the prudent ignores an insult. One of the more dynamic equivalent translations, I guess, is a little looser. Sometimes those translations are almost kind of like commentaries mixed with translations a little bit. But the Net is one of those. It says, the prudent conceals dishonor. The Septuagint says, the prudent man hides his own disgrace. And so there's maybe a few different aspects there of what that he was getting at. But the basic point is, the prudent man is doing the opposite of the fool. The fool is making it known, letting it out. The prudent man, whatever he's doing, he's not.
Prudent man may have got angry, but he kept it to himself and figured it out instead of making a public display of it.
Right. And how many times in your life, you don't have to go specific, but how many times in your life, at least generally, can you look back and say, I was either wrong to get angry so fast, or I'm just so glad I kept my anger back because I was, it would have been completely bad if I had let it go. I was completely wrong.
Yeah, when you keep it to yourself, you usually determine you were a fool without anybody ever knowing.
Yeah, and that's why it's a prudent man.
And next day you're like, I was foolish. And
yeah, and then, you go on with life and you're like, I'm so glad that we didn't have an explosion there.
Abraham Lincoln once said it's better to be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. So, then next here we've got basically Solomon's revisiting that same idea. He says, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly. Okay, this is Proverbs 14:17. He says, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. So, we've talked about that really why. And if you look in verse 16 of that same chapter, the wise man fears and departs from evil, but a fool rages and is self-confident. So we talked about quick-tempered man acting foolishly, those consequences of being hot-tempered, that it leads us to foolish actions we're going to regret. But notice the fool is also, in verse 16, self-confident, arrogant, self-confident. Well, if I'm really self-confident, in general, self-confidence isn't a bad thing. I have to be somewhat self-confident to stand up here and do public speaking, you have to be somewhat self-confident to speak to other people about Christ, or to do a lot of things in life. But self-confidence can be dangerous if it's tied in with arrogance. And if it's tied in with arrogance, you see this recipe growing. We're starting to add these ingredients, maybe a large scoop of self-confidence plus a healthy dose of arrogance plus a quick temper, and because I'm self-confident, well, of course I'm going to be quick to flare up and be angry because I'm always sure of myself. I'm always right.
Like some people think they're a know-it-all.
Right.
Yeah. When they got all those ingredients he's talking about, and then they think they're right about everything.
Yeah. And so then, how hard is it to really admit you were wrong once you've been angry, too? Because then, I have to always be right. I have to always defend myself. And then you just end up making a bigger mess that you didn't have to get into in the first place. It's kind of like those, every once in a while I like stories. I like stories about airplanes. And I like looking at some of the aviation safety things, and you'll see these accidents, and you'll learn, how they happen, why they happen, and sometimes when an airplane crashes, it was preventable. Somebody could have made a better decision, but because they started off on the wrong track, because of those decisions they made, it ended up in a wreck. And anger, here it's preventable. It's something you don't have to start, but once you start anger, it starts this ball rolling that's going to end up in a life wreck. And so that's what's really going on here. And he's just fast and open with his temper. Then that second part is kind of a different angle. A man of wicked intentions or evil devices is hated. It seems like it's not a contrast. It's like, one of those things where we're talking about the same thing, or maybe this is a cousin of what's going on. The Septuagint, as usual, offers something kind of a very different idea. But maybe what's going on here in this verse, a man of wicked intentions being hated. Well, what happens when you're quick-tempered and you're acting foolishly? What does anger often lead to?
Well, it can't be good.
Okay, can't be good. So maybe an evil scheme, right? Maybe something like vengeance. And so you end up plotting evil, coming up with all these evil, angry devices, and then you're hated. So I kind of see that maybe could be what's going on here with that verse.
A person who's always looking for reasons to be angry is also usually not well liked either.
That's
People
true.
around you can see that you're always looking for a reason to be angry.
Right. And we're going to see, if we get to it, to see that later on, there's Proverbs that talk about not just the fool who is angry, but the angry man, angry by nature. And that, like you're saying, they're looking for those reasons. That's their mindset.
Not happy unless they're angry.
Yeah.
I worked with a man one time that I worked with several that on one crew, and the boss of that crew told me, he said, "No, look, this guy, he's mad every morning when he comes in. If everybody else has got a good disposition that day, he will. But if there's one person mad, then he's mad all day too." So that's something else that goes with what you're talking about there.
And anger really affects other people and can influence them to get angry too. And we're going to obviously see that here in a little bit. Here in Proverbs chapter 14, over there in verse 29, he who is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly. And impulsive is also translated quick-tempered. So, in other translations, so the idea of impulsive is got to do with anger, impulsive to anger. And we've seen how, when you're quick-tempered, it's like you're lifting the banner of folly over your head. Because the consequences that result from that are just so disastrous. But notice here how we start out with someone who's slow to wrath has great understanding. If you think about James, why is James teaching this again in the New Testament? Because it's something everybody needs to understand. Notice it's one of the attributes of God. God is slow to anger. God is long-suffering. Well, God has a wisdom past finding out. So if that's the way God is, that should obviously be something we take to heart. But being slow to anger, why is this wisdom? Being slow to anger.
Well, you have time to sit and think about, if you're slow to wrath, when something does happen, you can sit down and think about this and maybe find about the best situation and how to deal with this. And you don't, you're not just jump up, and of course I'm sure that most of us have been guilty. We get into something like that and we're not slow to wrath, which we ought to be.
Yeah.
Take time to think about it and see what the consequences is going to be.
It also doesn't say never get angry. It says be slow to anger. And I think a lot of the respect, how many, those people that when they do get mad, they're like, oh, you respect the fact that he's mad because if he got mad, then this is a serious situation. And then you have the other people that, oh, he's mad at him,
It doesn't mean anything.
Say you're working on a project or on a car or something like that. If you're quick to get angry, you're going to make yourself more work in the long run because you're going to start tearing stuff up or messing stuff up instead of fixing the problem you originally were working on. If you're slow to wrath, the part that's irritating you might get done quicker, and then you're like, oh, this ain't so bad, and you go on. But if you're quick to wrath, well, then you're torquing things harder than you're supposed to, and stuff like that, and you end up breaking things.
Yeah, exalting that folly part. I'm mad, so I'm going to take this wrench and go whack, and then you whack your own foot,
And that's the same way with people if you deal with people like that. You could break a relationship there that'll never heal with words and anger.
Yeah, because the words we might say, have consequences more than we intended. But that being slow to anger, you're taking time to consider, and a wise man understands that. A wise man understands, like you're saying, hey, I maybe can get through this, or I need to consider what to do, or maybe even, what if I misjudged the situation? Do I really understand everything that's going on? That's what aspect.
Slow to anger also makes you have patience and being humble, and it's still hard to do though.
Yeah, and this is something that we deal with every day. It's not like, this is something that's extremely practical to every life situation. Even people in the world recognize this. But like you say, I like how you talked about humility going along. Patience and humility. Those are traits that are cousins to this idea. And so if we have patience, we have humility, those work with wisdom, those contribute to wisdom to help slow this down. And, I think part of his understanding is the wise man understands that anger has consequences. So part of it you're thinking, if I get mad right now, there's going to be consequences to that. Do I really, a wise person is seeing ahead. And they're thinking maybe it's like playing chess. Okay, if I move here, they're going to move there. Then, I'll have to move there, then they're going to move here. And you're thinking ahead, if I get mad, I'm going to offend this person, I'm going to, alienate them, push them away. Maybe that's not the right approach.
Like chapter 15, verse 1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but a grievous word stirreth up anger. If you're slow to wrath, you can calm the situation down like there's a dispute. But if you're quick to anger, you're just going to make the situation even worse.
Right. Well, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. Yeah, thanks for getting ahead there. But yeah, that's excellent. I'm thinking of a couple biblical examples of people who were quick to anger. And the ones that came to mind for me, Nebuchadnezzar and Jeroboam. In both cases, Nebuchadnezzar, he got mad at Daniel's three friends. You all remember that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't bow down to the golden statue. And Nebuchadnezzar got angry at them, exceedingly angry, because they wouldn't worship his golden image. Well, he was quick-tempered, and he decided to change his quick temper to a fiery furnace. That's how he was going to show it. Throw them in there. Then he learned pretty quick, that, well, I've been wrong. I'm completely wrong about my theology. Jeroboam, that when the son of Nebat, he was offering to his golden images, and the prophet of the Lord came from Judah and prophesied against the altar. He stretched out his hand, quick anger, and God froze it. And he realized, that wasn't a good idea. Instant consequences there. Instant realizing that was a foolish decision to make. I think about also Jacob. In the case of Dinah, Jacob it says he held his peace. When Dinah was violated by Hamor of Shechem, back there, I think it was Genesis in the 30s, 34 or something like that. When Dinah was violated by Shechem, I think we all are somewhat familiar with that story. Jacob held his peace because he knew that he was going to have to be careful how he approached this situation, because he wasn't strong enough to resist the rulers of a city. Now his sons Levi and Simeon, they were hot-tempered. So gird on your swords, we're going to go and kill everybody. And that was just the disaster Jacob didn't want. And so you kind of see how, in that situation, Jacob had more mature wisdom. This is a bad thing that happened, but I'm going to have to be careful how I deal with it. The sons, this is a bad thing that happened, we're going to go kill everybody. And, then, now everybody's going to kill me, is what Jacob was thinking. But there's one that goes along with this idea, jumping ahead actually, Proverbs 16:32, where it says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." Along with patience, along with humility, self-control. That's one of the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. And it's kind of key to having any other fruits of the Spirit. Self-control is one of the things we need to add there in 2 Peter chapter 1. So self-control is a key to developing what you need to be slow to anger, to developing patience. Because if you have self-control, when anger comes flooding in your soul, you don't let it out. And so that's why building self-control, building that muscle of self-control is essential to godly living. Because then you won't be taken over by sin. You have the ability, you have the power to say no to sin. So self-control, I think, is huge in this discussion. And in the Proverbs, it compares that to a mighty warrior. And there's actually an interesting story. Alexander the Great, he was a mighty warrior, right? He took cities. And one day after, he had had most of his successes, kind of taken over the Persian Empire there, he was having a drinking party. And one of the biggest problems with alcohol is it is the direct enemy of self-control. Alcohol is like drinking away slowly your self-control. So, since self-control is so essential to every other fruit of the Spirit, and alcohol attacks self-control, that's a big reason why a Christian shouldn't get involved in it. So, anyway, this Alexander the Great, he was having this drinking party, and words were being said. All his admirers were flattering him and telling him he was the son of a god and everything like that. And one of his best friends, Cletus, was the guy's name. And these admirers were saying, what, Alexander the Great, you're the son of a god. Your father, Philip of Macedon, he was kind of just nothing compared to you. All those generals who died in your, fighting for your cause or whatever, they're nothing compared to you, And, well, Cletus, he got mad. He was like, I remember the good old days before, when we had respect for one another, respect for Philip, respect for those guys, this is getting out of hand. So he said, well, I'm just going to stick up for Philip, I'm going to stick up for those generals who were my friends who died, and whatever. And Alexander the Great, being drunk, he got really offended, really that burning anger just like that. So he grabbed a spear and he went and killed Cletus on the spot. And afterwards, when he got sober, he realized what he had done, and he was just in almost suicidal depression for a few days before his flatterers kind of got him out of that by Alexander the Great, you can do nothing wrong. Cletus was actually a traitor, and so kind of boost him up. But he was one of those people who he could take a city. He was a mighty warrior. But as Proverbs 16:32 says, it's better to be slow to anger. It's better to be able to control your temper. And Alexander the Great actually learned that lesson firsthand. So we also see, self-control helps us be slow to anger. Proverbs 19:11, real quick, ties into that. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. So if you're someone of discretion or good sense, that's going to help you be slow to anger. That's going to help you, self-control, good sense. That helps you develop what you need. And in fact, notice here, you're glorying in this. What do you think that means? Okay, a little bit of pride. So you're taking pride, and I think this is a good pride in a sense, a good, I delight in. It makes me happy when I'm overlooking a transgression, I'm overlooking a fault. To be like Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them. I'm not going to make a big deal out of this offense someone made to me. In fact, I'm just so glad I'm not. Instead of being like, I hate them, but I guess I'll overlook it because God said so. The wise man's like, hey, this is an opportunity to exercise my wisdom here. They offended me, I'm going to overlook it. Now, that's kind of a hard place to be in, because when someone just offended you and transgressed against you, we're not in the mood to really be like, oh, I'm so happy I can overlook that. That's not natural at all. But that's that spiritual wisdom that's so important. So that's something that is part of that. And then here in Proverbs 15:1, so we've kind of seen, the whole slow to anger, and we've been building on that self-control is part of that, discretion, good sense is part of that. And I think when you have that idea in your head, next time you're in a scenario, if you can remember, okay, someone just offended me, this is my opportunity to practice that. That helps, because you're remembering, okay, hey, wait a minute, this opportunity is something I've thought about before. This situation, and I know how I should react, so I'm going to try it. We're going to go ahead and put this different thing into practice than the way I've been doing it. And I think that's part of wisdom. Here in chapter 15, verse 1, and also verse 18. Also verse 18, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And then in verse 18, a wrathful man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger allays contention. So the first part we see the attitudes, the causes, then we see the man in 18 who exemplifies that. So we'll just kind of end maybe for the next 5 minutes here on this idea in Proverbs 15. Because I think that, now we've kind of looked at the consequences of anger. Now we're looking at the origin of anger here. So a harsh word is what stirs up anger. A wrathful man stirs up strife. Someone who is angry, he just keeps adding to that cauldron. I think we've talked about that before. A wrathful man, someone who's looking for an opportunity to get mad. So he's looking for what? An opportunity to stir the pot. And that's really his problem. Versus the as we were talking about, that soft answer, trying to diffuse the situation, trying to be a peacemaker. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. So the wise man, he's a peacemaker. And the one who's slow to anger is a peacemaker because he doesn't want to end up getting mad. He's slow to anger. He's not like, well, I'll just let this anger boil under the surface and then I'll explode tomorrow. No, that's not his idea. It's like someone who's slow to anger isn't just, holding it in, just waiting for that moment to blow up on everyone. They're slow to anger. They actually want to diffuse and allay. And there's one excellent example, really, in the book of Judges. There was a time when there were two judges, and they had to deal with the tribe of Ephraim. And the Ephraimites were maybe a little bit hot-headed, a little bit quick-tempered in a way. But, man, if you didn't call them out to battle, you had committed a mortal offense. Now, they were bound and determined to have a battle, whether it was with the enemy or with you. They were, once they got on the warpath, they got on the warpath. So with these Ephraimites, that was their thing. It's like, you better call us out to battle. So here in Judges 8, watch what Gideon does with the Ephraimites. Now the men of Ephraim said to him, that's Gideon, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites? And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? That was Gideon's, hometown. God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. So notice how that soft answer is really being put into practice. Gideon's flattering him a little bit. He's humbling himself. He's like, I'm not hot stuff. You have a lot to have glory over. You want glory. Okay, well, here's some glory for you. And then the Ephraimites, they were like, well, how can we be mad with Gideon? He's not trying to insult us. And so their anger subsided. But then notice in Judges 12, over here, Jephthah, very different occasion, same problem with the Midianites. Judges 12, here the first few verses. Same problem with the Ephraimites. Then the men of Ephraim gathered together, crossed over toward Zaphon, and said to Jephthah, why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire. And Jephthah said to them, my people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon. And when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the people of Ammon. And the Lord delivered them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? And then we see here these remaining verses. They got together to have a battle. And the Ephraimites said, you Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. And so then they ended up having this battle, and that's the whole shibboleth thing. 40,000 were killed. So that example really, I think, is maybe a good one to end on here. Notice how in Scripture we have these two judges. One picks the soft answer, one picks the harsh answer. One diffuses this situation. The other, it turns into a full-scale war and 40,000 people die. So I think that's a good illustration.